The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. What is it like to be President of the United States? To sit, as so very few men have, at the center of power. One of the most intimate glimpses at life in the Oval Office comes with President Kennedy, Profile of Power, a new book by syndicated columnist Richard Reeves. It's a day-by-day, sometimes minute-by-minute account that follows the brief tenure of one of the most beloved and controversial presidents in American history. Reeves is former chief political correspondent for the New York Times and the author of several books on American politics and the presidency. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Since at the time you began writing this, there were already thousands of books about John Kennedy. What was it that you felt you could add?
I thought I could write it from his perspective. I thought the book could come from the center out and be about being President of the United States, what it's like, what he knew, when he knew it, what he said, what he heard, what he did. I wanted it to be truly a study of what it is like to be the man at the center of the action, the most powerful man in the world.
But here's a man who died 30 years ago. There are 6 living presidents. Why not one of them? Why John Kennedy?
Well, I've written books on 3 of the living presidents. They were more narrow books than this, but they were kind of journalistic books on Ford, Carter, and Reagan. So I was left with a very limited choice, and I was either going to do Eisenhower or Kennedy, because what I really wanted to write about was what, as you said, what is it like to be president? What does the president actually do?
When John Kennedy took office, what was the world that he inherited? What was the world like at that time?
Well, it was, among other things, the end of the industrial age of communications. He came to office when there was carbon paper and mimeographs and flash bulbs, and by the time he left, there were jet planes, the lasers, Xerox,
satellite broadcasts,
Valium, the birth control pill, LSD, air conditioning. There was an incredible explosion of technology and creativity then, so that I could also take the country, as it were, through that period, as he was our leader during that period.
When you looked at a map of the world at that time, countries were changing by the dozens. Boundaries were literally being redrawn all over the world.
In Kennedy's first year in office, 30 new countries joined the UN. The old colonies were breaking up, and it was a heck of a time. It was the density of event and of crisis in those years was almost unbelievable.
How qualified was he to handle that?
Well, no one, not too qualified, but no one is. I mean, part of the secret of only 41 men knowing is that I don't think anyone is ready for the job. They set out an agenda, they're professional politicians, but the job is reactive. On a single day when John Kennedy was president, single 36-hour period, he gave the best speech of his life, the American University speech calling for an end to the Cold War. But before that could be absorbed by the public, the first monk had burned himself to death in the streets of Saigon. George Wallace was standing in the doorway of the University of Alabama to prevent the admission of 2 Negroes, and Medgar Evers was shot to death in front of his own house, in front of his own children, waiting for the president to give a speech on civil rights. That was one day in the life of John Kennedy.
We look back at that time and you think of the 8 years that Dwight Eisenhower was president, and that seems like such a quiet time in retrospect, and it's almost as though a switch was thrown and things just began to explode as we moved into the decade of the 60s.
I think that they did explode, and partially because communications speeded up, and suddenly we had this. It used to be the presidents could control the flow of information to the country, to the voters, to the people. Now it's up and down on the satellite immediately, and all of that began with the Kennedy presidency, so that more things could happen in less time. He lived only 3 years, but there were more events in his time in those 3 years than the 8 years that other people had.
One of the sentences in this book is that you say that the United States is born anew with each president who takes office. What was given birth when John Kennedy took office?
What was given birth, I think, was a generational change, a change from an old man as president, and suddenly when Americans woke up on January 20th, there was a young man who was president. His wife was 30 years old. He had two little children, so that instantly the country changed because the national mirror was showing a different face. We were old when Eisenhower was president. We became young when Kennedy became president.
How pivotal was the fact that the night John Kennedy was elected was a very long night because the margin of victory was, to use a famous phrase, razor thin, literally so?
It was, well, what it was like for him was that he carried a slip of paper in his pocket which said 118,000. The number was written out, which is what he won the presidency by. So that he was going to spend, the man was a professional politician with a very, very small mandate, and he was going to be as cautious as possible, or at least he thought he was going to be, as he walked into that empty building. They take all the paper out of the building when a new president comes, and they take the portraits off the wall, and as you said, we began anew.
One of the things that really took me by surprise in your book was that when John Kennedy met with Dwight Eisenhower, he had been in the Senate for 8 years, and yet these two men had never sat down together to talk politics.
Well,
to talk about an issue in Congress.
No, they had never talked to each other, which gives you an idea of how qualified Kennedy really was. He was not important enough in the Senate even to get to meet the president. But in that meeting, the day before John Kennedy becomes president, they did not like each other. Eisenhower called him Little Boy Blue, not with him. They sat down for a couple of hours, talked about being president. Eisenhower thought Kennedy was going to get it wrong. And then they walked out, and in his diary that night, Dwight Eisenhower wrote, "I still don't like him, but now I know how he got to be president. I've never seen such force of personality." Jack Kennedy went outside where his brother Robert was waiting in the car, and Bobby said, "How was it?" And he says, "I still don't like him." He said, "But what a force of personality. Now I understand how this man could become president."
So they came to respect each other, if not to agree with each other.
Well,
anyway.
they did come to respect each other. That's probably, since so few people have done it, they've got to respect each other, and they probably have got to commune over the generations.
They were very different men. Eisenhower, a military man, and carried with him into the presidency a lot of that use of structure and a pecking order and a protocol that he followed in his management style. Kennedy flipped the coin over, completely different.
Yes, he had more style than management. Kennedy saw himself being at the center. Eisenhower saw himself being at the top of a pyramid. Kennedy saw himself as being in the center of the action, and he abolished the organizations within a day that Eisenhower had set up to feed information to the presidency and then to follow through on orders. None of that happened in the Kennedy White House. He had a bent toward chaos because he thought if things weren't organized, he could control everything. He could control every person. His relationships were bilateral. No one knew all of John Kennedy. And while it served his personal needs, on occasion it turned out to be a disaster.
Now, one of the first examples you get to of the Kennedy management style, and it's kind of an unsettling description to read, is how he picked his cabinet. It was almost like, that's how he picked his cabinet.
Yeah, 9 strangers and his brother. Was what they said at the time. He didn't think it was greatly important who he picked. He thought that he was going to be able to run the presidency by himself, find the right man here or there, and if he didn't get the right man the first time around, you'd get him the second time around. That was what the disagreement was between him and Eisenhower when they met. Eisenhower also wrote in his diary that night, "This guy thinks it just means putting the right people in the right places."
But he hired absolute strangers.
He
didn't know, people he'd hardly talked with.
Well, he said, all I know is people who can help you be president. I don't, help me get to be president. I don't know anybody who can help me be president. So he picked a cabinet, which the most important jobs, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, head of the CIA, his national security advisor, were all Republicans, because they had the experience after 8 years of Eisenhower.
And also he was very aware of the fact that he hadn't won by very much, and felt bipartisan was really the way to go. And it was remarkably bipartisan.
Yeah. Well, he wanted to be protected on the economy and on defense. It was remarkably bipartisan, but the country had a consensus at that time. So Republicans and Democrats could serve together. They could, they were all facing the great, the Russians are coming time. And Kennedy stuck Republicans out in front of him like a shield.
Like a heat shield.
Exactly, yeah. They were there to take the heat.
But as I was reading that, there's a saying about laws like sausages, you know, you don't really want to know how they're made. It's fairly unsettling. You think that these people who are elected are kind of in control, know what they're doing, and there's a lot of serendipity involved.
Well, there is, after Kennedy's first night in the White House, a friend of his, Charlie Bartlett, said, "How was it? Did you sleep in Lincoln's bed?" And Kennedy said, "I slept in Lincoln's bed." He said, "I just jumped in and hung on." And he was still hanging on 3 years later. The job is impossible. No one can do it. It's an act of faith between the American people and the man, someday the woman, they send up there. And as long as we will suspend disbelief a little bit, a president can function, but it gets harder and harder as communications speed up. Bill Clinton told me that he envied Kennedy the fact that he had an adversary so that he could blame people and ask for things. And Clinton's now in the position he has to try to sell stuff positively, and it's much more difficult than negatively. The whole interstate highway system here was built as the national defense highways. The thing being, the Russians are coming, we better have roads to move the tanks.
Right, we're building our fallout shelters.
Yeah, yeah.
Getting our canned goods in order.
I went to college on a national defense education scholarship. I was supposed to help stop the Russians when they came. At any rate, Clinton said he envied Kennedy that. Of course, on the other hand, Kennedy was looking down a nuclear barrel the whole time he was president, too.
As you said, he had a great belief in himself and his personal magnetism, and truly he was. He was somebody who set the whole country on fire in terms of being excited about him. But it got a terrible blow when he met with Khruschev in Vienna in the within the first 6-7 months of his presidency. Talk about that meeting and what happened.
That meeting led to Vietnam. Kennedy had done so badly at the Bay of Pigs that he thought he could go one-on-one with Khruschev. He was a man who believed in his own charm. One-on-one, he could persuade anyone of anything. His life was this kind of serial seduction. However, Khruschev was not open to being seduced, and Kennedy, who was quite sick at that time, he was taking his Addison's disease medicine, which kept him alive, corticosteroids. He was taking Novocaine in the back for the pain. He was taking amphetamines regularly, as he had since the first debate with Nixon, and he didn't know anything about communism. He had lied about his background, saying he'd gone to the London School of Economics, so no one ever told him really and he hadn't gone there, what Marxism was. And suddenly he's locked in a room with this 68-year-old coal miner, and the communist dialectic is Khrushchev's life, and he just tied Kennedy in knots. Within 10 minutes, Kennedy was defending colonialism, which he didn't believe in. He was defending imperialism, which he didn't believe in. He was defending the right of American business to run foreign countries, which he didn't believe in. He was defending military dictatorships because he had gotten caught up in this Marxist dialogue. And after a day and a half, he staggered out, saying, "He savaged me, he savaged me." What people were reading in the papers was different from what actually happened, and said that he was going to have to do something to prove to Khruschev that he was not stupid and he was not weak. And when James Reston, the first man to see him after that, said, "Well, what are you going to do to prove that?" And he says, "We're going to stand up to them in Vietnam."
How did you reconstruct all of these conversations that take place throughout this book? The book is so dense with detail and specificity.
Well, the biggest help was that it was all taped. Kennedy had tape recorders in the White House too. He wanted to use to write his own memoirs, and those tapes still exist. It takes a long time to listen to them. Some have been transcribed, but not all. So that often you can get the direct dialogue, and then because the presidency is so magic to us, everyone in a room takes notes on what happened, including the president himself, so that I was able to build this mountain of conversation and of paper and decision-making of what went on hour by hour in the Oval Office, and then began the business of carving it away to find the center and to find John Kennedy.
And in fact, there's a very thick section at the back of this book that documents all of the different sources. Were you concerned that people were, there have been controversies about sort of imagining what it might have been like had somebody been there. Were you concerned about that in terms of the credibility of this book?
I wasn't concerned. I thought I could back up everything, and apparently I have. I thought that, professors of history around the country might come out of the woods and say, what are you, you're a newspaper reporter, you can't write about it. But it didn't happen. I mean, there is an enormous amount of paper around a presidency, and you can pretty much prove everything that happened if you go back. I mean, it took 30 years for a lot of these documents to come out, and some of them came from Moscow, and I found a man named Georgy Bolshakov, who was the go-between Kennedy and Khruschev in those years. He was an officer in the KGB, undercover here as a magazine editor. So what I wanted to do was reconstruct the presidency, and there is enough to do that.
You mentioned that the press coverage was different than what was going on, and you mentioned in the book that the press coverage of this man was pretty positive.
It was pretty positive. To the point, again, that had to do with the national consensus, though, that to the point when the Bay of Pigs failed, and Kennedy was literally in bed crying. He'd work in bed in the mornings, again, because of his back, and was literally, the first two men that came in saw that he was crying. But when he came downstairs and gave a press conference and said that victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is an orphan, this was a defeat and I'm responsible, what he said, which we remember him saying, then what he said after that was, there will be no national purpose served by talking about this anymore, so I will take no questions on the Bay of Pigs. And no reporter or anyone else ever asked John Kennedy a question about the Bay of Pigs. The consensus in the country was such, if the president didn't want to talk about it, then none of us would talk about it.
Sort of like what we saw during the Gulf War.
Or more, but more so during Kennedy's. At least in the Gulf War, the press was, who I feel was terribly manipulated, but at least we were jumping up and down, and a few of us were saying, right, what the hell is going on here?
So how does that color how we viewed this man? How accurate a picture did we ever have of him during his life?
Well, we had a fairly accurate picture of him during his life, except for the one great mystery, at least not mystery, but something I feel I uncovered, which was that he was basically a co-conspirator on building the Berlin Wall, and that was a genius decision that reduced tensions in Europe, because the real problem was people fleeing communism through Berlin. Other than that, I think that people in the country had a pretty good fix on where he was as president, to the extent that he released information. What he didn't release, people could not find out in those days, and some of the great frustrations, his health and other things, were never known to the public. Today, with 1,000 books out on the assassination and on his sex life and whatnot, I think people have totally lost sight of who the guy was.
There is a contrast, though, between, for example, on civil rights, between our memory of him as someone who was far more involved and affirmative of the civil rights movement than this book describes.
I'm afraid this book is his life, and that he didn't want to get involved with civil rights. He saw it as a foreign policy issue that made us look bad around the world. So that when he found out about the Freedom Rides in 1961, again, he was reading the paper in bed. He found out there was a revolution by reading the New York Times, and he called in his civil rights advisor, a young lawyer named Harris Wofford, now Senator Harris Wofford, and he said, Harris, look at this. This is terrible for us. Get your goddamn friends off those buses. And Wofford said, well, I think it's too late for that, Mr. President. What do you mean it's too late for that? 3 months later, Wofford was in Africa with the Peace Corps, but Kennedy, through 2 years, tried to block. On the one hand, he tried as president to block the civil rights movement, not because he was against it, but because he thought it was bad for the country, and never knew that it was his rhetoric, we've got to get moving, one man can make a difference, you must go out, you can't wait your turn, was part of the fuel of the civil rights movement.
He was part of the inspiration for it happening.
And was stunned when he found it. And then after 2 years, like Lincoln, who didn't want to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, Kennedy, after the events of Alabama, went on television on June 11th, 1963.
That's
and
the speech we remember.
It was a great speech. It was mostly ad-lib. And it put the government on the side of the minority. And that was no small thing in a democracy. He said, this is not a legal question, this is not a political question, this is a moral question. What kind of people are we? And if we say we have equality, who among us would choose to be black if they had a choice? It was a great speech.
And
it was
remains one of the strongest speeches on this issue made by an American president to this day.
And he didn't want to make it, but because he thought it would just be trouble. And he thought at that time that it might cost him the presidency.
Not only was he worried about it as a foreign policy problem, though, wasn't he worried about it as a congressional problem? And as a member of the Democratic Party, it had split very badly over race in 1948, and it was still, his domestic agenda could go down the tubes very easily.
Everything could go down the tubes if the Southerners in Congress, Richard Russell and Allen Ellender and Eastland and people like that, turned on Kennedy. The amazing thing was that he got 2 years with them thinking that he was secretly on their side, but he was just a Yankee politician who had to say these things. And with the Negroes, as they were called in the South, feeling also that that he was on their side. He only went on television when Lyndon Johnson told them that as long as, you have to choose, that as long as both sides think that you're on their side, this will escalate and there'll be more and more and more violence. And Kennedy was persuaded by that argument.
But there's always been a lot of debate about Kennedy, if he had lived into a second term, what he would have done about Vietnam. There's a lot about Vietnam and our deepening involvement in Southeast Asia. In fact, we'd had our first casualty by the end of Kennedy's first year in office. Do you have any sense, having gotten this close to the man, what he would have done?
I don't know what he would have done, but I know he got us in there. I mean, it was John Kennedy, not Lyndon Johnson, that got us into Vietnam, and he got us in when he personally, in the break in the March on Washington in August of 1961, Kennedy signed off on U.S. backing for a coup in South Vietnam. In that coup, because he couldn't deal with GM, this was our guy and he wasn't taking orders. We got to get people in who'll do what we think should be done. So that we backed the generals in overthrowing him. He was killed, his brother was killed, and from that moment on we put these generals in who were like sergeants in the old French army. We paid for Vietnam and we ran it. So that Kennedy was the de facto leader of that country. It was an American colony before he died, not after. By then we had 17,000 people in there. When he took office there were 600. So that what would he have done? I think he would have gotten out if he could figure a way to do it and not end up with a who lost Vietnam debate in the way the Democratic Party had almost been destroyed by the who lost China debate. I hope he would have gotten us out of there, but there was no indication he was going to do that.
No, and in fact, the pace of the book quickens and things get more and more interrelated as you're going further and further into the book, and there certainly isn't any sense from the way you've structured the history that says there was any way we were going to get out of this morass.
Well, he thought, I mean, I think Kennedy went up and down a little bit on it. I mean, many times, not many times, but he was quoted in private as saying, you know, the day is going to come, they're going to throw our asses out of there. And one of the reasons we wanted GM out was we suspected he was dealing secretly with the North, with Ho Chi Minh, for a united or a federated Vietnam with no foreigners in there. We were the foreigners in there, and we wanted to stay.
You touched on his health a little while ago. How critical was that? How did that shape the decisions that he made? The fact that he was numb half of the time, or on amphetamines, had his own kind of personal Dr. Feelgood with him.
He had the Dr. Feelgood. Max Jacobson traveled with him. His health was unbelievable. He was an extraordinary brave man, but all of the medication he was taking, he was really promiscuous with medicine far more than with women. Often have side effects which include a sense of overconfidence, which you would not want a president to have. Increased sexual desire was a side effect of some of them too. I mean, undoubtedly it had an effect, but no one knows what effect it had on him on any medication. But he was taking enormous amounts of it, and he lied and lied and lied about his health through the campaign and through the presidency. And if people had known that he had a fatal disease being maintained, I don't think he could have been elected. And at the end of his life, where he was in a little better shape, he had taken exercise regimes and built up his muscular structure, which always looked terrific from the outside, but the Secret Service was already preparing for a second term in which he'd be in a wheelchair.
You were in college when John Kennedy ran for the presidency. Do you have personal memories of him? What do you remember from your own time, your own experience?
I remember that I voted against him. My father was a Republican politician, and so I was filled with, it was my last vote for my father. I changed sides as soon as I was safely out of the House. I remember the energy and the youngness and the optimism. I think that's what we all remembered. We seemed to be going someplace, and John Kennedy was a great leader in the sense, whether one agrees or disagrees with any decisions he made, because he certainly fulfilled the first requirement of a democratic leader, which is to bring out the best in most of the people most of the time. And John Kennedy did that. He made us feel younger and better, and we wanted to do something to make the world a better place, whether or not we had voted for him, and then all that was ripped away.
So what kind of president was he? What's history going to say about John Kennedy? Was he a good president? Was he a mediocre president?
No, I think Kennedy will finish in the top 10. That, if for no other reason, then his actions on the Berlin Wall stabilized, although if people had known what he was doing, he might have been impeached. But he took that risk secretly, backing the wall, and I think that there was less chance of a nuclear confrontation at the end of his term than there was at the beginning. Plus, he had put the government on the side of the minority in civil rights, and that's a very difficult thing to do in a democracy with a majority rule. So that I think he'll be remembered well, if for no other reason than so many things happened in those 3 years. He might as well have been president 8 years. If you follow the density of event, I mean, the world was exploding around him all the time, and most of it he handled relatively well, except for Vietnam, where he was foolish.
Well, it's a wonderful book, a wonderful book to read, and I hope a lot of people do. Richard Reeves, thanks for being a guest on Upon Reflection. The book, President Kennedy, Profile of Power.
He was an extraordinary man.
Thanks again.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.